Hi. Okay. Want to welcome everyone. We're gonna give it a minute here as people gather, and we'll get started. Should be an exciting session. All right, we give it about 30 seconds here, and then we'll get going. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to our first version of Signature Live, which will be an ongoing series every other month. And what we'll do is we'll take people into a deeper dive from one of the cover stories of our signature magazine. This month is one that was titled "Robots That Don't Suck" and talked about the prospects and concerns of AI for publishers. A little housekeeping here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Ron Levine. I'm the editorial director for SIIA and our AMMP network. So this we have an SII antitrust statement. It's important to avoid discussion of sensitive topics here, including any specifics around pricing, cost information, and other similar topics. We also have a fairly strict code of conduct in the way we go about everything, and we have a code on the site, and of course we're very much committed to our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, and as you see here. Also, good news for association folks is we are a CAE approved provider. And as a provider in this educational program related to the CAE exam content outline, this program may be applied for 1 credit toward your CAE application or renewal professional development requirements. Okay. Some upcoming events in our network is we'll have a Slack chat September 8th. And then after a month off, we'll continue with our editorial training series on reader engagement and metrics and the convergence of content and marketing. And then the next Signature Live will be strategies for seeking out new voices. All right, well, today we're very fortunate to have 2 great speakers and then the publisher of Signature Magazine, Carla Kalogeridis, to lead us through. So Carla, why don't you take it away?
Okay, terrific. Can everyone see me? Not yet. There we go. Hi, everybody. welcome. We're so glad you're here. Let me just start off by apologizing. We had a terrible thunderstorm in Florida last night, and I'm in an unfamiliar location, so hopefully the Wi-Fi will hold up. And if not, Ron will step in. So excited to have you all here today. As Ron said, this is a Signature Live is a new offering of the AIM-IPI network. It's a live extension, really, of Signature Magazine. It's a chance for you to speak and engage with the interviewees of our cover stories and to ask whatever questions you might have wished you could have asked when you finished reading the story. So that's sort of the point. We won't be recovering old ground that we did really in the story. We're going to build and kind of move on from what we started in the story and move on from that discussion today in the webinar. So we're going to keep moving forward on this topic. I'd like to introduce our speakers first, and I'm going to ask each one of them to just say a minute or two, or a sentence or two about yourself, your background, your involvement in AI, and then to answer this question to get us started, which is, what is the most important thing that our participants here today need to know about AI and publishing? What's the one thing that they absolutely need to take away from today's discussion? So let's start with Paul Lekas, who is our Senior Vice President of SIIA, which is the parent association of the AIM-IPI network. Paul?
Hi, great. So my name is Paul Lekas, and Carla introduced me. I handle all public policy and government affairs for SIIA, and it's over 450 members, which includes publishers and companies that are involved in AM&P, as well as a range of other companies, from the largest technology companies in the world to startups to financial information providers and education technology companies. I have worked in AI policy in the US government before coming to SIIA and spearhead our work on AI policy here. We're very active in advocating for frameworks around AI regulation in the United States and Europe and other jurisdictions. And it's an area that is increasingly of interest to virtually all of our members. So it's great to be here today. And Carla, did you want me to say something about kind of a one key takeaway for the publisher space? So as I think David will go into much more detail, AI technologies can provide a lot of benefits in publishing. And so, the sorts of things that AI is able to do is not something it's something really that David, I think, can speak to, but what I look at are what the potential ethical issues may be down the road. And I think what my one takeaway is that AI is not really a plug and play set of technologies. And for the more mechanical things, it can be very beneficial and is something that probably can assist in your practices, almost immediately. But as you get into much more substantive AI tools and applications, such as content generation and research and editorial work, it is an area that's more fraught, and it needs to be approached with care. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And next, our second speaker, David Brake, who is COO of Page Magic. David, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and also answer the same question Paul did about the one key takeaway you'd like our participants to have when they finish this webinar today?
Sure, Carla, thanks. It's great to be with you. I'm a publisher, former publisher, I should say. I spent much of my career at Time Warner, Pearson, and McGraw-Hill. So I pride myself in thinking like a publisher and what publishers do. In my role with Page Magic, we look at how can we bring AI and other technologies to make that publishing process more efficient. And I want to point out, we know this, that AI is everywhere. We hear about it regularly, and often the popular media, they tend to focus on the spectacular, like the self-driving automobile that killed a pedestrian in Phoenix a few years ago. Or as recently as 2 days ago, an article in the New York Times that talked about the app that can create original art based upon narrative instructions from the user, something that may challenge our definition of what is art. But for publishing, we need to remember that much of AI is based on rules and processes. Rules and processes, that's what we do as publishers. It always has been, but it's not all that we do. Understanding your audience and nuancing content to inform, educate, and entertain that audience is still very much a human endeavor. So if AI can help with the rules and the process, we have to ask ourselves, how much time can be saved or invested in the things that humans can do better than a machine? So my takeaway message for today is that it's not an all or nothing proposition. And again, I'm glad to be here with you today.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So before we get started, I just want to let our audience know we really do want this to be interactive. So please feel free to put questions into the Q&A box, and we will. You can do that as we go, and I will check the box periodically, and if there's any questions there, I'll work them in. You don't need to wait till the end. So please feel free to do that if you like. All right, so what I did was I reread the book that I wrote, and I tried to identify what were the few key takeaways that I wanted to build on for this discussion. And hopefully you all will find them interesting as well. And the first one for me was that AI is going to change the way that we publish things, right? And so, David, you said in the article that, some of the most common uses of AI now are taking over some of the tedious, repetitive tasks that are involved in publishing, such as, processing article proposals or peer reviews or trafficking and tracking illustrations and so forth, checking on rights and permissions. But where are we headed? How do you expect the technology to evolve? And are any of us on this call going to see a robo-editor during our career?
Well, Carla, if you envision the role of a human editor becoming extinct, I don't see that happening. But let's think about what an editor does. To some degree, they follow a language style manual. They pay close attention to the format of the content. They follow rules. They follow a process or a workflow. Now, a robo-editor can do that now, or at least help do much of that. But having an awareness of your audience personas, knowing what's important to them, how to position your content, how to tell your story, that's what makes us human. And until we have AI that achieves true sentience, has emotional intelligence, and that creative spark that humans have either evolved or been endowed with, well, until we have that, I don't think that a fully functional robo-editor is going to be taking any of our jobs.
Okay. Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what David said. I mean, I think there is likely to be a temptation in the publishing world to bring on more AI text generators to assist in the preparation and review of material. And there are now several very prominent large language models that you've probably read about, which are similar to the image application that David mentioned earlier, where you can provide a few inputs and these models will generate a sentence or paragraphs of text or poems or other forms of writing, prose or poetry that you may desire. And, having reviewed some of the output from these models, it's not always, sometimes it's good, but it's not always exactly what you want. And so it creates challenges. Now, those models are going to improve dramatically year over year. To the point where it may be tempting to rely on them, I think, but they do lack what David raised, which is the true human element, the consciousness, the understanding, because they're really based on applying a set of constantly evolving rules to generate what seems to make sense. And that's only on the text generation side. I mean, I think also all the work that goes into writing, all the preparatory work is something that is going to be very hard for a machine to replicate, but machines can assist in that process in a way. And I think that that's probably at least where the industry is going to go in the shorter term.
Okay, so to both of you, and Paul, you can answer first if you want, and then we can go to David. Why aren't more association publishers using AI in their daily workflow? What do you think are some of the barriers to adoption, whether they be philosophical or resource?
Yeah.
You know, what is your thoughts about that?
So on this, I would love for David to go first, because the association publishing industry is something that I'm not an expert in. I do a lot of work around AI, but I think I would be speculating more than David in this case.
All right, let's have David take a crack at this one.
So Carla, I'd like to just briefly comment on something that Paul said with reference to text generation. And I might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I do think there's a role for AI with that. Think of newsletters that have news summaries, or think of when you are, I know there's several applications out there right now that allow you to put in key content, and it will create from that LinkedIn posts or tweets, which can save you an awful lot of time. Now, you still have to have a human review those.
Right.
It may not be exactly what you want, but I think it serves a purpose there. Now, Carla, in the article that you wrote for, the cover story article, no, I don't think a robo editor or author is going to do that, but I think that it does have a role. But to answer your question about, the barriers
to adoption, yeah.
I think it's tradition and culture. Think about it. Spreadsheets and emails have been around for almost 3 decades now. And as an industry, we were relatively quick to, use these new technologies. And yet still many publishers are still doing what they did 20 years ago. If I had a nickel for every publisher who told me they were still sending emails and tracking things with spreadsheets, I'm not sure how much I would have, but I hear it a lot, all right? It's probably not completely efficient. It's tedious, it's repetitive, and it's definitely subject to human error. But we think it works, and that's become kind of an accepted cost of doing business. So the drive to incorporate more AI into our workflows, it actually requires us to stop for a moment, to think about the ROI of what we're doing now, and maybe adopt a slightly different, I'll call it a publishing worldview. That's hard for some publishing cultures to do because their workloads and performance pressures, they continue to increase. And it's really counterintuitive. And think about this, to be faster and more efficient, we first need to stop, reflect, and think differently, but we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge with any technology, implementing any technology is, especially for association publishers, publishing teams that are doing so much with so little, taking that time to pause and reflect and look at processes is so hard. It's so hard to pull away. There's always that next deadline to meet, right? Absolutely. So that's great advice. Paul, I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything you want to add before I move on to the next one?
I thought that was, it makes a lot of sense what David has laid out in terms of what the barriers are to adoption. And just building on what he said about some of these language models, there is value in relying, once these become more available, commercially available and appropriately vetted and so forth, relying on them to generate first drafts of material. I think that could be a potential huge time saver, which equates to saving more money and being able to apply your resources in other places.
Okay, terrific. So the second key takeaway from this article was, and we're just building on something we just said, is that AI won't replace humans in publishing, but it will help us humans do more. David, I remember in the article you said that a well-designed AI publishing system can handle about 70% of the work performed by a human. And I found that very interesting. How much of that work that's currently being done by some publishers with AI, how much of that work still needs to be checked by a human? And, just talk to us a little bit about what are some of the limitations of AI and how are those going to change as the technology evolves?
Well, first of all, the figure 70%, it clearly varies. It's like mileage on a car. Your mileage may differ. It depends upon your publishing environment and your workflow. But underlying that number is the notion that AI is not perfect. It's not 100%. It probably never will be. So I like to use a simple example of the spelling and grammar function check, or the grammar check function in Microsoft Word. We've all used that. And you can save time and potential embarrassment by using that. It's great to have a machine that will scan your document and point out every departure from the standard rules. But keep in mind, you still need to check and approve those suggested corrections and changes. And I'm sure that everyone listening to this webinar has probably hit the ignore button more than once or rejected a suggested correction because it was wrong for the context of the thing that you were writing. And this is a smaller scale example that underscores actually the need for a human, for a publishing professional to be involved. It's a great aid and assistance, but it is still very much human driven at this point.
Okay, terrific. Paul, I want to talk a little bit about the ethical concerns, because David mentioned earlier that he feels that one of the key barriers to adoption for especially associations and nonprofits might be on the philosophical side. And it's easy to see how that could be a bridge to ethical concerns. And I remember in the article, Paul, you said that, perhaps some are concerned that one day publishers might, rely on machines more for content than humans. Right. And that particularly for associations, that could be an ethical concern. And so I'm wondering if you could expand on that for us a little bit. And should those ethical concerns deter association publishers from adopting AI more fully?
Yeah, I mean, I think it builds on what we were talking about earlier. So these, when you're looking at AI model to do something that is that ordinarily would involve a level of human judgment, making decisions, generating content, things of that nature. We need to understand what actually goes into the model because these models are not value free, and I think I noted in the article that that there may be biases of a programmer that are built into the algorithms unknowingly. Unintended biases that will have effects as the AI model grows. And it's not just the models, it's also the data that is relied on by these models. So for example, if you have a language model that is generated solely by looking at content from certain types of publications, and you are relying on that to generate content for your own publication, there's a vast world of perspectives and viewpoints out there that are not reflected, and there could be biases that end up coming out in the text or the content that is generated by that model. So it's really important to understand to make sure that there's an understanding of what the models are, what the data is that is relied on by those models. And that's not to say that every publisher needs to have a technologist who understands all of this, but there needs to be there needs to be work done on those tools by the developers so that those who are using the tools understand what potential biases and limitations there could be. And I think this comes out not just in content generation, but also to the extent you're relying on tools to do some of the underlying research for you. And it may be very hard to spot what those biases are, which is why there is a movement among developers, but also among government agencies to try to promote more accountability and transparency in algorithms and the underlying data that feeds into those algorithmic models.
Okay, David, anything to add on that?
Well, I want to say that I agree with Paul for the most part. I think there can be programmer bias entered into it, but I also think that AI can be used to identify areas where diversity, inclusion. It can't necessarily fix them, but it can be used to identify some of those areas that you want to take a more close look at. I don't have any specific examples to tell you how that's done now, but it's the other side of the coin that Paul is talking about.
Yeah. David, I remember in the article that you said that AI could rewrite an article in the style of Ernest Hemingway. Should we as publishers have a problem with that?
Well, I do. As an English major, and any English major could tell you this, they can tell the difference between the writing styles of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and Thomas Wolfe. And AI can reduce those styles to formulas, to word prints, if you will. But let's not forget, the way those authors put words into a sentence doesn't begin to turn someone into a Hemingway whose life experiences and perspectives sort of fueled that natural storytelling ability. This may be less important if you're publishing a handbook or something technical, a reference, or maybe contributed works where the information itself is the product, rather than if you're creating a story with a narrative arc, or creating what I call the vicarious verisimilitude of the bullfight. You won't do that with AI, but you can replicate Hemingway's style if you'd like that to be something that you'd like to do in your emails or your articles. Why someone would want to do that, I don't know, but yeah, it can be done.
Okay, Paul, let me ask you from an ethical standpoint, David mentioned like a book where associations obviously are prolific book publishers. If you're putting together a book and it's being contributed by multiple authors, content's being contributed by multiple people, it would be easy to make that connection that, wow, for the reader, in some types of books, it might be an easier experience if the content was all written in one style, even though it was contributed by multiple people. So what if we used AI to rewrite content that came from multiple authors for a book into one common style? Do you have see any issues or concerns with that ethically?
So, I mean, I don't see any ethical concerns with that. I think that in that sense, I think AI could be really beneficial. I do think that, at least where the technology is today, you still need to have a human eye on that afterwards, because it's possible to make even minor edits that have significant material effects on the underlying text. So, but I do see that as a valid and a helpful use of AI to the extent we've got tools that can do that well.
Carla, I'm actually going to raise an ethical issue there. All right. I think that comes down to the relationship you have with the author or the contributor, and the contractual relationship you have. If you have a work for hire agreement and you state very clearly that you have the right to do this, and the expectation from them is that you are going to do this, then I think that's okay. But if you were taking somebody's work, and I don't care whether it's more technical in nature or a story, and you're going to have AI rewrite that, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that Paul would agree to that. So the ethical concern for me is the relationship you have with your authors, and do they know what you're going to do with the work that they submit?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, that's kind of a different universe of ethical concerns, but it's essential here because you're talking about humans who are contributing products to a larger endeavor. And so trust is there, and you need to make sure that you have an understanding with each of the authors about how the text will be treated. And so I would completely agree with David that is a valid and important set of concerns to keep on the top of the list.
Okay. What about the relationship that associations have with their members? So, right, so members join the organization often primarily to get information. Sometimes, a lot of times the association is the authority in that industry or profession that it's serving. And the members are looking for that particular association's voice or expertise or analysis. So what about the relationship with the readers? Do we have any kind of obligation to say this book was edited with assistance from or put together with assistance from artificial intelligence?
I think that comes down to the relationship that you have with the reader. There's a lot that goes into publications where the reader may have a general understanding that there are editors involved, and there are researchers, and there are lots of people who are involved in trying to generate the product that is out there. I think that the reader is relying on information for its accuracy and insight and other sorts of values. And if you're delivering on that promise to the reader, which may differ by publication, I don't see a real concern there. But it also dovetails with the issue that we've talked about before. If you're just using AI, you're not actually checking it and reviewing it. You can't really assure the reader that you're providing the product that they're expecting.
Okay, fair enough. David, any follow-up to that?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to a branding and positioning issue for the publisher. I don't think that we should apologize for AI or think that it's something bad. I mean, it's not the cubic zirconium of the jewelry world. It's not a real diamond, but it looks like it is. That's not what it is. I think that there are people out there, and granted, I am biased, but I think that there are people out there that would look at an organization using AI and talking about it as being, very progressive. I think it could actually be part of the brand promise to the audience and the membership that you serve, but it needs to be positioned and explained in a particular way.
Okay, perfect. So in the article, I think, Paul, it might have been you that suggested in the article that AI technology should be sufficiently nuanced to reflect diversity. And I want to ask David, from a technology standpoint, is that even possible?
Well, I guess that's a little problematic when you talk about nuanced. What is the definition of nuanced? And we could spend some time talking about that. But my answer is, to some degree, and I'll use an example. Earlier in my career, I published textbooks for the allied health markets. These are books that had thousands of illustrations and photographs and were, 1,100 pages long. We were always concerned that the illustrations and the photographs reflect the diversity of the students in our target market. We would ask the authors and the editors to be sensitive to this. We even had reviewers who would evaluate the manuscript before publication just to make sure that we were doing this. And we still got it wrong at times. Well, today with AI, you can meta tag all of the illustrations and the content in a book or a magazine, and that process becomes much easier. It's not perfect, but it's much easier. And you can also store those meta tag chunks in a digital asset manager, making them searchable and usable for new books, derivative products, or articles that you might be doing downstream. So I think to some degree, the answer to your question is that, yes, you can use AI for that. Okay.
What if you're using AI for research, let's say, and it's possible, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that the AI might grab biased data that a human might have questioned. Is that a concern, and how can publishers prepare for and kind of address that concern? Either one of you can jump in.
So I'll say that when we're talking about ethics and bias, it goes both ways. There are also, at least theoretically, the ability to use AI tools to to remove unintended bias that would be generated through a human-only process because of the ability of certain tools to evaluate and compute a significant body of underlying information and data. So, it is possible, I would imagine, and I haven't looked at, particular tools that would do this, but, to employ AI tools to assist in research and actually try to remove some of the unintended biases of the researcher who's working on a particular article. I think that, again, if publishers are going to use tools, I think as much as possible, they should understand those tools, and they should understand, how experts and the manufacturers, the developers have assessed those tools, and whether there are blind spots there that need to be compensated for. I think anytime you're looking at a vast amount of information, research, data, there's a possibility that you're going to be incorporating evidence that reflects some sort of bias, and it's impossible to remove all of that bias. Likewise, it's impossible for an AI system to be completely free of bias, and sometimes there are biases that you want. So being as aware as possible of what the capabilities and limitations are of the tools, and then appropriately, incorporating them into the workflow to generate that kind of research.
Okay, fantastic. David, anything to add to that?
Well, using AI in research is certainly not my area of expertise, but I think we all can relate to journal articles and publications that, years later, months later, even after they come out, are criticized because of bias. I think that's one reason that journal publishers have a peer review, and we very much believe in that peer review process. But the fact is, humans are biased, and sociologists can give you all the reasons why we are, but it happens, and you're not going to change that in the human brain, the human soul, if you will. Are there some things that AI could possibly do to mitigate that? Yes, I think that I think it probably can, but AI is not going to eliminate bias and make it a more perfect world that we all might envision living in.
Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit and try to drill down to some practical questions about implementing AI in publishing. Who on the team needs to be sort of in charge of this, right? Because if you look at this, the typical association publishing team, you obviously have a publisher, you might have the folks on the sales side, you've got editor-in-chief, managing editor, associate editor, copy editors, you've got the graphic designer, art director. And I was thinking back when video started getting really popular and is part of a storytelling tool for associations, a lot of associations couldn't afford to hire a videographer. So we editors learned to do video work, and we would start recording and videotaping our interviews. And, a lot of us even learned basic video editing. So just, thinking about a publishing team, and if you want to expand that to think about, who is typically in an association leadership team, who really needs to wrap their arms around this and run with it? And if an association is interested in implementing AI in its publishing and communications efforts.
So David, you want to take a first crack at that one?
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think first of all, you need to look at your definition of what is a team. At the ground level, I think you have to have teams ask themselves, what are the most tedious, time-consuming tasks associated with managing authors, writers, contributors, sharing files and versions of things, transmitting things to production? And where does human error become a factor in that process? At the management level, it's really about cost and efficiency. I mean, think about it. If you could reduce your organization's investment of time and facilitate more higher level creative work, what would that mean to your bottom line? And more important, what would that mean to your company culture? So I think that you need to look at it from a couple of different perspectives when you talk about publishing teams.
Okay, Paul?
I'm gonna rely on David's answer there. I thought it was perfect.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Because I think that's a legitimate concern for associations, especially small and medium teams. So maybe the answer is to look for an outsourced expert for a while until you know whether you need to actually, well, like in the, now I'm really dating myself, but back in the beginning of the website era, right? Everyone didn't have a webmaster on their team. Now most people do. So maybe it's something like that.
Carl, I'll just add
yeah.
to that if I could.
Yeah.
Most of the larger publishers that we work with, they have somebody usually at the VP level who's in charge of digital transition. All right, now that's a title that didn't exist when I was growing up in this industry, but these are people who are tasked with doing the exact thing that you're talking about. Where can we bring in technologies, and what can we do as we transition to a more digitally oriented workflow, product, and environment? Now, it may be prohibitive to have an association have a VP or director of digital transformation. Carla, as you said, there are people out there they might be able to rely upon to help them, again, think about what they do. And it gets back to that pause, reflect, and maybe adopt a new worldview. And then, instituting that into your culture certainly is another challenge. But I think that's important to consider. Okay.
Terrific. Ron, I know you're not on screen, and I keep checking the question box. I'm assuming I'm doing it correctly. Are there any questions there that I'm missing? I don't know if we can hear from Ron.
Yeah, sure, I can hear. You're good, Carla. There were a couple, but you've actually hit on them.
Okay, well then, I'll tell you what, if there's any questions, I'm going to pause from time to time, or Ron, if you want to step in and say, hey, we've got a question here because they're not showing up on my device.
Sure.
Okay, are there any we need to ask now, or they've been covered?
Nope.
Okay, terrific, fantastic. So the last question that I have here for our guest is about expanding on, where do associations start? If you want to test the waters, if you want to say, all right, this sounds good. Yes, we're interested in efficiencies. Yes, we're interested in improving our processes. Yes, we're interested in having more time to do other things to serve our members rather than the mundane. What does dipping your toe in the water look like? Where do you start? How do you lay the groundwork? What's the first thing to do? And David, I'll let you start with that, and then maybe Paul, you can perhaps give us a high level, sort of executive level view of what the executive leaders need to be doing if their team wants to move forward with something like this.
Sure.
So David, why don't you start?
Well, I think I already touched upon this. I mean, give yourself a brief pause. Think about the workflow and the processes that govern much of your work lives. Once you start looking at that, you can always send out a request for information to companies and organizations that are involved with this. Carl, I think the work that you're doing, providing information to your audience, is important. We shouldn't think of AI as an inherent threat to our industry, but it's something that can be a liberating technology. And there are ways that you can start small. As I said, it's not an all or nothing proposition. Maybe one of the things you want to do is to focus on author management. Let's say that you're publishing, a product, a book with multiple contributors. Each of those contributors have contracts. They need to have emails that go back and forth. You need to make sure that they sign their contracts. There's a specific workflow associated with that AI and process automation can help. It might be tracking permissions and handling permissions. It might be creating content that is more accessible to audiences who, have different accessibility needs. So you can almost dip your toe in any place and find a solution that will help you with that. And so, experiment with some of that. But again, I think that gathering more information, maybe via an RFI, that's an important first step.
Okay. And before I move on to Paul and get his kind of high level, executive level view on this, I want to ask David, I believe you work with an association or two or a nonprofit that has some really, we're talking about dipping our toes in the water, that does some really interesting things with AI and in their e-newsletters involving polling and things like that. And I just thought maybe you could take a minute or two just to explain what they're doing with that, because that might spark an idea of how one of our participants would like to start.
Sure. Well, newsletters, as we all know, I mean, they've been a staple in the industry for a long time, and as well written as they might be, as exciting as they might be, it's still a one-way communication. It's possible to create a newsletter that is interactive. So you can actually embed some questions into the newsletter, capture feedback from your audience. Now, I will tell you, you're not going to have 100% of your readers respond. But even if you have 10%, that's statistically valid. It lets you know what they think. And if you ask them some open-ended questions, natural language processing, which is a part of AI, can actually read those comments and characterize them as positive, negative, neutral. So now you're not only learning what your audience thinks, but why they think that. And that can be an invaluable insight. The client that you're referring to, they are using their newsletter to introduce new product and concept ideas where they're very excited about it. They're going to be offering this. They'd like to know what people think. When would they avail themselves to these particular services? So in some sense, it combines a survey with a newsletter, but it's very nuanced and it's done in a very interactive way that allows people to truly communicate. I'm not promoting our product because there are things that, other ways that you can do it. But Carla, that's I think that's the example that you were referring to.
Yes, that was. Yes, thank you. All right.
So I think we may have lost Carla for a moment, but I'm happy to. I think she was going to ask me for my. Oh, Carla's back. Let's give her a moment.
I think I lost. Sorry, I moved too far. Paul, can you add? Go back to and address that question about from an executive level leadership. What do they need to be looking at with AI?
Yeah, and in some ways, this might have been a good point to start with, which is that AI is truly transforming and changing a lot of society, and there are AI tools that can be incorporated in a number of different ways, and they're going to be improving every year. And so I think it makes sense for every publisher to look at how these advanced tools can actually make their product better and their operations function more efficiently. And to identify those kind of at a high level, identify what are the gaps, what are the things that we are not doing now that we want to do, what are the things that take too much resources that we want to streamline. And are there tools out there that we can incorporate to address those big concerns we have, which may help to increase our readership, it may help to lower our costs, and help the sustainability of our publication. The move towards digital has been a long time coming, but incorporating some of these tools to improve the businesses and the products, I think, is really essential, and that does need a C-suite eye. I think David has identified a number of different ways that organizations, publications can dip their toe into AI technologies to try to improve their own processes and efficiencies. Without going towards the full, we are just having robots generate all of our content do all of our work. I think we should look at this as a piecemeal approach. Newsletters, generating content for newsletters is a really great idea. Using natural language processors to evaluate comments from readers is helpful, especially if you're getting a large number of comments. It's very hard to stay on top of all that and organize it with human eyes only. So, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about whether to have a digital transformation officer, what the value of that is. And I think it depends on the size of the publication. And for smaller publications, it may not make sense to have somebody whose entire job is dedicated to that, but that is a function that needs to be recognized at the highest levels and needs to be part of I think any publication's way forward. Is how are we going to better transform ourselves for the digital age, and by using some of the technologies that the digital age has engendered.
Okay, terrific.
I second that.
Yes. Excellent. So we're nearing toward the end of our time here. Is there anything left unsaid here? Any bit of advice that you might have to our attendees about anything at all? Any final takeaway that we didn't talk about? David, do you want to go first?
I'll just say, I think it's an exciting time to be in publishing. It's an exciting time to be part of an association where you are looking at not redefining your relationship with your audience, but engaging your audience maybe in different ways than what you've done before. You know, that audience represents individuals who could be subject matter experts, could be, you know, contributing to some of the things that you produce. They've got perspectives that can be very, very valuable to you. And I'm just very bullish on the future, not because of AI, but I think that AI can be part of it. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Paul, anything else from you? Any final message?
I like what David said. AI it's out there, it's transforming industries, and there's not a one size fits all approach. It's not just plug and play everywhere. You have to figure out what works best for your product, your publication, your organization, and then look for what sorts of tools are out there to help. And I'd say that, engaging with like-minded publications through associations is a really helpful way to develop lessons learned, best practices, identify products that can be useful, products to avoid. And so I think that, the association structure such as SIA is a good place to engage in those discussions. Excellent.
And to all of us who are overworking and going too fast and rushing around trying to meet deadlines, I think we got to take a deep breath, slow down, schedule some time in your calendar to explore these ideas with your team and just kind of ask, what if we could do this? What if we could try that? It's important because in the end, it's going to save you a lot of time and resources and free you up to do other things that may serve your members even better. So I thank you both very, very much. It was a great discussion. We did just what we set out to do, which was to build on what was covered in the article. I'm really excited about this new Signature Live show, and I hope our attendees are as well. We'd love your feedback and comments. Ron, is there anything at all we need to say before we let everyone go?
No, this was great. Just want to thank everyone. Thank David and Paul for their time.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next Signature Live in October. Thank you again.
Thank you.